Frid älskade vänner och välkomna till idag som är den 27 januari och den internationella minnesdagen för förintelsens offer. Det äger rum samma dag som förintelselägret Auschwitz-Birkenau befriades 1945. Och den här dagen är till för att vi aldrig ska glömma förintelsens offer. Det judiska folket som fick betala ett oerhört pris var på gränsen till förintelse. I detta som man kallade den slutliga lösningen. Men då hade han inte räknat med Gud. Gud har andra planer. Upprättar hebreiskan, för tillbaka folket till landet. Israel är ett under och ett vittnesbörd ifrån Gud till hela världen. Nu råkar man illa ut igen och det är fruktansvärt. Man kan knappast ha ett nyhetsprogram idag utan att nämna Israels folk lidande i dessa fasansfulla tider. Förutom ett nyhetsprogram som kommer från Israel 7 har vi då ett newsflash med väckelsesång. Vi ska sjunga mitt i lidandet, säger Bibeln. Det kan vi bara göra med Israels Guds ande. Ruach. Låt mig bara få läsa välsignelsen som jag faktiskt predikade över i söndags. Jag predikade hur Israels Messias uppenbaras i den text som handlar om Israels herde. Han som ska föra folket tillbaka som en herde. Föra dem till landet för att aldrig mer ryckas upp därifrån. Israel kommer att bli och är oövervinnligt och allt detta beror på Gud. Och ni vet att man har försökt, men Gud har vakat över det. Precis som han har lovat och sagt. Jag kommer aldrig att glömma då rabbinen här i Göteborg i den judiska församlingen sa en gång till oss. Ja, kan hända att när Messias kommer så visar det sig att vi väntar på samma person. Det här har jag funderat på många gånger. Gode Gud. Trodde han verkligen på att Jesus var Messias? Vet ni att det gör faktiskt många rabbiner idag? Vi går till Sakarja 12 och vers 10 och läser. Men över Davids hus och över Jerusalems invånare ska jag utgjuta nådens och bönens ande, så att de ser upp till mig som de har genomborrat. De ska sörja honom så som man sörjer ende sonen, och de ska gråta bittert över honom som man gråter över sin förstfödde. En dag så ska Israel se och förstå att vi faktiskt, precis som rabbinen Volkov sa, vi väntar på samma person. Och då måste ju denna samma person vara Israels Hashem, eller hur? Ja, det är han. Han som har fått namnet över alla andra namn, för att varje knä ska böjas och varje tunga bekänna Jesus vara Herren. Uppenbarelseboken 1:7. Se han, Jesus alltså, Jeshua. Han kommer med molnen och varje öga ska se honom, även de som har genomborrat honom. Och alla jordens stammar ska jämra sig över honom. Ja, amen. Jag är alfa och omega, säger Herren Gud. Han som var, är och kommer. Den allsmäktige. Och vi vet att jordens kungar ska omringa landet. Omringa Jerusalem. Och så ska man gå till strid. Dumma som man är och förstår inte att man strider emot den allsmäktige och den allsmäktiges folk. Och det kan ju bara sluta på ett sätt. Och ni vet hur det slutar. Då ska vi välsigna det underbara folket. Judarna och Israel som har gett oss evangeliet, och därur kommer Jesus Kristus. Halleluja. De är källan. Frälsningen Jeshua kommer från judarna. 4 Mosebok 6:24. Herren välsigne dig och bevara dig, Israel. Herren låter sitt ansikte lysa över dig, Israel, och vara dig nådig, Israel. Herren vände sitt ansikte till dig, Israel, och give dig frid. Och nu önskar vi er alla Guds välsignelse. Och vi tänker vidare på Israel och ber för judarna. Speciellt den här dagen, det tänker jag göra i alla fall. Gud välsigne er, så hörs vi senare här under dagen.
Seven's Israel at War update. And as we continue to deliberate the latest from here in Jerusalem, it's always important to remember that 112 days ago to date, the Islamist terror groups from the Hamas-plagued Gaza Strip launched an onslaught on southern Israel, declaring war by perpetrating a massacre, murdering some 1,200 mostly civilians, wounding over 4,800 others, and kidnapping 246 people, including elderly, women, men, children, and infants. 136 of them remain in captivity to date. Let's now turn to our TV7 editor-at-large, Mr. Amir Oren. Amir, what can you update us with on the latest?
So fighting goes on, obviously, in Gaza itself, in the northern district where Israel has gained operational control, even though there are squads and individuals who are still generating firefights. In the central district of the so-called refugee camps, and mostly in the south, especially in Khan Yunis, which has been encircled by 3 IDF brigades, with a 4th one composed of special forces methodically dismantling the Hamas infrastructure in the tunnels, hoping to get both to the Hamas leadership as well as to hostages who are probably being held close to the Hamas leaders. But the most important news of the day comes outside of Gaza and of the Lebanese-Israeli border, where there are still exchanges of fire. It comes out of The Hague, the decision, the temporary decision by the International Court of Justice regarding the South African complaint that Israel has committed genocide in Gaza. Of course, there is no validity to this charge. And most especially out of Washington, where President Biden has deployed CIA Director Bill Burns to meet in Europe with 2 of his counterparts, David Barnea, the Israeli Mossad chief, and Abbas Kamel, the Egyptian Minister of Intelligence, as well as the Prime Minister of Qatar. They're supposed to bring back to the respective leaders, the Israeli government and Hamas, as mediated by Qatar, a draft for a grand deal which will include the release of all Israeli hostages, the release of Palestinian prisoners from Israeli jails, probably also Palestinians, Hamas operatives, criminals, one should say, who took part in the 7th of October massacre, and the cessation of hostilities, some halt in the fighting, not the end of the war, but some pause which could take several weeks or even a few months. This is still to be decided. So as we are approaching the end of January, as was presupposed, as early as mid-November of last year, things are reaching a decision point.
Thank you, Mr. Oren. Let's now turn to one of our 2 distinguished guests here in the studio, namely Dr. Uzi Arad, formerly the director of the Israeli National Security Staff, National Security Advisor, and a Mossad Division Chief. Thank you for joining us, sir. I'd like to start by focusing on those deliberations taking place in Europe, which have been ongoing since the start of the war, since the Islamist terror groups launched their onslaught on Israel, and speak specifically to the challenging relations between Qatar and Israel, relations that overtly do not have relations with one another. Nevertheless, Qatar, which trying to evaluate it within the scope of the American scheme, is serving today what in the past, potentially, Ali Hassan Salameh used to serve in providing the Americans a gateway or a patephon, so to speak, into the world of bad actors, namely the Islamic Republic of Iran, the Taliban, and other actors, including the Islamist terrorist organization Hamas.
Well, in today's practice, nations have all kinds of channels, and you don't have that division between the bad guys and the good guys, in which case the bad guys are to be avoided. The complexities of current practice is that you do engage sometimes with parties who are sometimes members of the other side, and all kind of deals are struck often in non-traditional ways through back channels or even front channels. Now, it is a fact of life that Qatar chose to play a certain role in the region and in this business. And it has played the role that we all know. It provided money. It wants to increase its own influence internationally, its own prestige. It has this dual face in which it is having relations also with Iran and is sometimes antagonistic to the moderate part of the Middle East and so forth. But it has been a useful role that it played, and all parties sought to benefit of that. So it should not be penalized for anything. It should be influenced into playing the role that is expected of it. And therefore, its presence now in connection with the hostage issue is to be used. And at the moment, there is expectation that pressure will be brought to bear by the United States and by others on Qatar to behave more responsibly and to put its own pressure so that a deal would be struck. And the deal indeed is being attempted. The point of the matter is that the hostage issue, which is a standalone in a way, it's a humanitarian issue and so forth, and demands an urgent resolution because of the concern for the safety and life of those held in captivity. Here, the clock is ticking, but this is all tied in to the other parts of the crisis, primarily to the war termination steps taken. And of course, the Hamas is trying to calibrate the way it releases the hostages, calibrated to its own interest in reducing the pressure on it, the military. So all these contacts become part and parcel of the phase of the war that we are now in, which is approaching the war termination phase, which then everything ties into it. What will be left instead? What is to be planned for the day after? So we see all this minuet, and in this minuet, the parties are playing a role. It is important that the United States plays a central role, that the head of the CIA is there, is a man of recognized abilities. So it demonstrates the fact that America is taking the lead and exerting its influence, wanting to stabilize matters and to resolve matters however it can be done. And this is the phase we're in, and it will continue so. And I think that we are now seeing in a way, hopefully, unless something escalates elsewhere, we are seeing the gradual reduction of the intensity of the war and an effort to resolve some things. Some want to maximize their gains, sometimes wants to minimize their guilt, but these are all parts of the dance at the war termination phase.
Absolutely. Let's now turn to Brigadier General in Reserve Amnon Sofrin, Dr. Amnon Sofrin, if I may highlight, a former commander within the IDF Intelligence Directorate, as well as the Chief of the Intelligence Directorate in the Mossad. Thank you for joining us, General. I'd like to ask you particularly about, on the one hand, what also Dr. Arad just mentioned, and that is the diplomatic dimension and how that correlates with the advancement in fighting on the southern front in particular, but also the state of play on the northern front, where Israel is in a mode of containment, in a mode of absorbing punches, but also dealing some tactical shifting strikes. And by doing so, it does not intensify, at least, the level of intensity of the current fighting vis-a-vis Iran's proxies, namely Hezbollah and various affiliates.
Let me say, first of all, regarding the southern front, I don't see the termination of war, not yet. Maybe a cessation for a while. It can be a month, it can be 2 months, dependent on, of course, to what agreement or what kind of agreement will be in the end. But still, we are not done yet with Gaza. We are still fighting in Gaza, not only on Han Yunis, even though the main effort now is on the area of Han Yunis, but still, on the northern part of Gaza Strip, there are squads, like Amir mentioned before, and people on their own, people who come and launch rockets and launch RPGs and so on. So it goes for the central area, where the refugee camps are, the big refugee camps, where we left our presence and reduced our deployment, and are taking advantage of that. And Hamas proves that he's still kicking and alive, and he's not done yet. He didn't wave the white flag. He didn't give up. He's still fighting, up to the end. Now, regarding the northern arena, Nasrallah always says, since the beginning of the war, he says, we're going to launch this war until the war in Gaza stops. As long as still we are fighting in Gaza, even though there's going to be some ceasefire, maybe, hopefully of course, because it will bring back our people from Gaza, but still, he will maintain the fighting as long as the fighting in Gaza goes on. At the same level, meaning he's engaging mainly military targets. He's retaliating even if we hit residents in southern Lebanon, like he says. That's the equation he set for himself. And he's playing according to his rules, or to his equation that he set up. And I don't see that anything is stopping in Lebanon. Now, the efforts to get to some diplomatic agreement that will implementation of 1701, I don't see that it bears fruit so far. And we'll have, in the end, to dismantle Hezbollah in a way in the next future. I don't know when. We can't do it right now in parallel to what happens in Gaza. We'll have to wait and to do it in the next phase.
Mr. Oren, is the necessity to wait for a latter date to contend with Hezbollah, taking into consideration also the fact that the implementation in one way or another of 1701 without dealing a decisive blow to the Iranian proxy in Lebanon would harm Israel's deterrence quite substantively? Within the calculus of Jerusalem's consideration at dealing also with the securing of the border region, and then by doing so allowing the residents once again to feel safe enough to live in the border regions.
Jonathan, you are framing a very practical question, but the discussion must be theoretical even before it is practical. What is the meaning of victory? How can you measure your relative success, and how long into the future can you project your current achievement? And that is because short of occupying the enemy's capital, killing its leaders, perhaps even occupying the country itself, destroying the entire arsenal and preventing somehow your enemy from being rearmed and regrouped. Short of that, it is not really what Netanyahu calls total victory. He has changed his vocabulary. Earlier on, he spoke about victory, pure and simple. Now it's total, absolute victory that he demands. It's unachievable. Now, in the north, assuming Israel initiates war against Hezbollah, not the war of attrition that we have now, but a full-scale invasion of South Lebanon, a fantastic strike on its precision-guided missiles, and then what? And Nasrallah being killed and some other leader emerges. Does Iran stop its relationship with Hezbollah? Does it stop the supply of arms? What are going to be the repercussions? So the most that Israel can gain, if one goes back to the practical solutions, is for Hezbollah to withdraw from the border, take its commando force, Radwan, several thousand people north of the Litani, either unilaterally. It doesn't have to agree with Israel about anything. Nasrallah can simply say, okay, I have decided to withdraw, and if my decision changes, you will see them. Now, will the residents of the northern settlements refuse to go back just because there is no agreement, which may or may not be enforceable anyway? This seems to be the practical outcome that Israel can aim at.
Within a short-term period, I agree that a decisive victory is unattainable. Nevertheless, if we're talking about long-term...
Decisive, perhaps. Total, not.
Long-term, total, decisive, it is possible, but to take into account the social construct of things. When we're looking, Dr. Arad, about the Arab social construct, we're talking about families that affiliate themselves sometimes to 2, 3 terrorist organizations, sometimes to one, major one, but in a mode of survivability. And that is true both to the Gaza Strip as well as to Lebanon. The Radwan forces, which Mr. Owen just mentioned, the majority of them make out of families that occupy southern Lebanon. And therefore, can one expect those same forces to basically lay down their arms and claim we're not part anymore of Hezbollah, or leave their homes and move northward without a decisive demand either by kinetic or other means?
Well, one should, if one wants to enforce that kind of a creation of a buffer area, then this can be accomplished through creating that kind of pressure, kinetic and otherwise, that would make it worthwhile for the other party to accept it. And I can see the possibility that some creative diplomacy with powers that have the ability to put pressure on Lebanon and the Hezbollah, with some practical ideas on the ground, that perhaps there would be some Israeli contribution also to the creation of this cordon sanitaire. And then to have the Lebanese army, you could do that. It is not beyond the limits of ability of doing that, and to secure that cordon sanitaire. But then that is also, that's a limited matter. The Hezbollah in full force would be there. Its rocket capability would be there. But so it only improves to some extent the confidence that people can have, and improves in some degree the defense that you have to put in place to prevent raids of the kind that was perpetrated in Gaza. It may take a skirmish, but maybe by judicious diplomacy and really hardball practice, you can get to that without that, by simply having the threat that unless agreed to amicably, it will come to a confrontation. And in the confrontation, one loses. The Hezbollah may not be defeated completely, but will have to pay a price. So might we. But to prevent the price that they would have to pay if they come to that kind of a show of force, they may come to an agreement. But for this, one has to do very energetic diplomatic moves, and they should be attempted.
Some may consider, though, that if you weaken Hezbollah enough and bolster their domestic enemies within Lebanon, the equation might shift organically, not necessarily with Israeli assistance. But General Sofrin, I'd like to ask you also, particularly because when we're looking at the region from a holistic scheme of things, we understand quite well that Gaza, Lebanon, it's all tentacles of the Iranian regime trying to bolster or at least save some of its strategic assets and tactical assets in the region. And therefore, when you look at the broader aspect, and we're hearing also in the United States considerations and deliberations regarding the posture in the region, including in Syria, including in Iraq, how does one look at this situation and analyze it from a Israeli perspective?
We're in the midst of a multi-arena fighting. It comes from Iran. Iran is the head, it's the octopus that activates everyone. Qasem Soleimani, the former head of Quds Force, was the one who designed this concept, getting out the directives directly from Khamenei, the supreme leader, and they built up the whole concept of engaging Israel from every point surrounding Israel, meaning Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Gaza, establishment of cells in northern Samaria and in Judea as possible, the Houthis in Yemen, and the pro-Iranian militias in Syria and Iraq. All of them together engaging Israel was the vision, in the end, to apply huge pressure on the Israeli society that in the end will collapse and the whole state will turn down. That was the concept, okay? Now, when the war began, the Hamas expected all the other allies to join, according to the vision. It didn't happen. And they were frustrated, and in the beginning they said, what are the allies doing? Where are they? Nobody's helping us. And each one of them has his own interests. Hezbollah doesn't want to go into a total war with Israel because of his own interests and because the Iranians are holding him up. They said, we didn't build your capabilities in order to engage Israel for the Palestinians in Gaza, but just in case Israel is going to attack Iran, you will be the first one to respond. And then you maintain some pressure, and just bear in mind that Hezbollah, for the first time in history, publishes every day who was killed by name and by picture. And you number the people, showing off that we are participating, we are sharing your blood, we are making a lot of efforts, and we are supporting you, but to our extent, according to our interests. Okay? The same goes for the Iranian militias or pro-Iranian militias in Syria. They launch rockets from time to time from the southern part of Syria, but without causing any big damage. The most important are the Houthis in Yemen. They're controlling the Bab al-Mandab Strait, they're controlling the entrance to the Red Sea, and they are very active. And even though there is a huge international coalition, they're engaging the coalition without any being frightened.
What's very interesting on the aspects of Ansar Allah and the tribes within that composition is that following the strikes of earlier this month, the 11th specifically, the other tribes pledged allegiance, showing and showcasing this publicly, repledging allegiance to the Houthi tribe and its leadership, something that, of course, needs to be closely identified. But we don't have very much time, and I'd like to give each of you 1 minute to respond to this. Before the war erupted, following the October 7th massacre, there was quite the evident disagreement between Hezbollah and Hamas, particularly showcased following the rocket launches by Hamas, which then tried to separate itself from those decisions of this group. Are we experiencing now, also with regard to what General Sofrin just mentioned, a certain division within the various compositions of Iranian infrastructure?
We should always be ever so humble in our analysis and predictions, because most of us, perhaps all of us, misjudged the Hamas reluctance to help Palestinian Islamic Jihad when PIJ attacked Israel or engaged in a fight, and we believe that Hamas is deterred for its own interests. Apparently, it waited for the right time and circumstances to strike. And the same goes for Hezbollah. Just as Amnon said, Hezbollah is the strategic reserve of Iran for the day Israel decides to strike Iran. But perhaps it will act out of another consideration.
Dr. Arad?
Well, this coalition that Iran is managing does not consist of obedient elements that all follow the same script. And they are managed, and each one is also crafting its own route. What we can expect is for this to continue. That is to say, now Hamas is trying to retain as much presence in Gaza as it can. But even if it will lose its operational capability out of Gaza, Hamas will continue, in fact, possibly intensify its effort on the West Bank and elsewhere. And in that connection, it will also continue its cooperation with the Hezbollah as it had in that context, because the West Bank is closer and operationally there's been some assistance to that. So one can expect that Hezbollah will support to that limited extent that it does, as permitted and instructed by Tehran, but also lend a hand to what Hamas will take, possibly to escalating on the West Bank to the extent possible. Remember, the unifying element is Jerusalem. How will Hezbollah act? For the moment, it does this controlled participation, which is bounded. But one can always see which way it goes. And finally, the Yemenites, all those various tribes, they too are now being, there is an effort to restrain their activities by another international coalition. And probably it will end not with a sudden disappearance of that, but also being another part manipulated by Iran, but participating in the battle from its own corner. So we'll see more of the same, but elsewhere, in different theaters.
General Sofrin?
I would say that this coalition will still be valid after the war, when the war is over. Iranians will not give up. They will still maintain this coalition. They will intensify, they will learn the lessons. Hamas' strategic goal is to control, or to gain control on the West Bank, and to be the sole representative of the Palestinian people, and not to replace, in a way, to replace Fatah. They will maintain the links with Iran because Iran supported her. They were dragged into Iran us because of the siege we laid on Gaza. They didn't have any other options, so the Iranians were there to assist them, and they will maintain the links with Iran and with Hezbollah as well.
Indeed. Well, this is all the time that we have for today. I'd like to thank Dr. Arad, Dr. General Sofrin, and Mr. Oren for taking out of your times to update us on the latest. And I'd like to thank all of you at home as well. Following this update.
Sorgfull så ofta i världen jag var, tunga den börda av synd som jag bar. Men då till korset jag lyfte min blick, frid i mitt hjärta jag fick. För Jesus är i livet för mig, ljuset han är på min stig. Allt jag behöver i honom jag har, Jesus är i livet för mig. ingen förmådde att hjälpa min själ. Men då kom Jesus och allt gjorde väl. Friden mig fyllde och synden försvann, likt solen härligt upprann. Jesus är i livet för mig, ljuset han är på min stig. Allt jag behöver i honom jag har, Jesus är livet för mig. Fattig jag är men dock rik i min Gud, ringa i världen men konungars brud. Misskänd av många men salig ändå, glad att till himmelen gå. Jesus är i livet för mig, ljuset han är på min stig. Allt jag behöver i honom jag har, Jesus är i livet för mig. Snart är det glömt hur på jorden det var, glömt är det hon som för Jesus jag var. Och när som brud jag i himlen går in, Jesus för evigt är min, halleluja. Jesus är i livet för mig, ljuset han är på min stig. Allt jag behöver i honom jag har, Jesus är i livet för mig. Jesus är i livet för mig, ljuset han är på min stig. Allt jag behöver i honom jag har, Jesus är i livet för mig.